What we're going to cover today has something to do with making sure that what you plan to perform on a contract is what they're asking you to, because that's directly related to whether or not you get paid and, of course, how much you get paid. So in that regard, we're going to dive right in. I will have to go to off-screen for seconds here because I'm going to pull up more outside forms than this PowerPoint has. And just bear with me if you will. I think you'll benefit from it. Number one, what we're going to cover is the sample specification sheet right on screen so we can see what it's like and what it's about. We're going to look at some plans and very specifically we'll talk about that. Not so much the detailed plans, but particularly the bid component of that. That's one of the things we want to understand, that what are the tools that you do in bidding to make it work, and what are some of the steps, what are some of the best things to know, and some of the things as we would call rules of thumb. We're going to look at a sample and cover some of those RFP types issues. The basic understanding of the specifications is primary. Every job has specs. You got to make sure that you're complying, and if they're wrong or if they're incomplete, you have to speak up and make sure that you get those questions answered and close those doors. How important are the front sections of the specifications? Very important in terms of all the things you have to do. There's standard specs, there's the special specs, but you want to make sure that you have it. What are the relationships between the specs, plans, and contracts? We're going to talk a little bit about that just to make sure that you can understand that when a public agency is going out to bid, they're using these documents to try to lock down the scope and the width of what needs to be done. But it's not easy. It's a moving train in that regard. So there are things that have to be clarified. Site walks are critical. You'll hear us talk about that more. But the idea is to understand those relationships and how to interpret certain actions that are required from these specs, from these plans, from these standards. You got to understand both the spec sheets and you got to understand how you bid them, how you add them up, how you accumulate your costs and ultimately go out for the bid. There's definitions that we'll cover throughout, both in terms of symbols and those kinds of things. Well, one of the things that we have found, particularly in the beginning, is that it's most important to use the worksheets. And that's what we're going to focus on today. There'll be, probably over half dozen worksheets that I'm going to pull up as separate screenshots that you can see and we can work through, rather than just dive into one set of plans and look at all the components of the mechanical, electrical, et cetera, et cetera. But you do want to understand how to navigate and go across, and we'll talk a bit about that as we look through these worksheets. You want to have the basic understanding of the RFPs, how they work, when they work. Most of you have probably come across worksheets and what we would call the RFP package, but it's always good to be able to bounce off questions and thoughts as it applies in different situations. You want to interpret the meaning of the actions that are required, and when we go through some of these worksheets, we'll look at the detail of a pre-date checklist, for instance. What do you look at when you start bidding a job? What are all the points you have to think about? These are things that we're going to try to do and cover today. And then it's important that we have a request for clarification. It's an unusual company that doesn't come across in their career time some plans and specs that aren't matched up 100% with what is intended. And you have to make sure that you request clarification. They will submit that not only to you, but to others, because sometimes you'll catch things the in-house staff just has not. Basic understanding of specs. There's bid documents. There's the bid advertisement. What that is, you see about it. We push very hard for you to look at your websites. There's a number of them. Those of you that are in the business development program, you can key it back to your SIC or NASAS codes that are specific to what your talents and skill sets are within your company. There's addendums. Something that comes out as a bid advertisement will change. If it does, they add an addendum. If there's a clarification, they'll issue an addendum. The bid proposals themselves are what you're submitting in, and then there's sample contracts. All of this works in concert to make sure that what you end up bidding on and producing is in alignment with the client. Then there's conditions. There's general conditions that apply across a broad spectrum. As a matter of fact, most of your bids will have what they call standard specs, and those specs apply to basic types of features that are so widely used that they make that standard spec. The general specs are something you become more and more familiar with. One of the tricks we'll give you right off the bat is that sometimes those general specs change. And if you're not up to date, if you don't have the latest, you want to make sure that you aren't planning for a general spec that is no longer enforced. Something new is, and that could cost time and money for you. There's special conditions that apply specifically for this particular job, a variation of a general spec or a unique item. And then there's supplemental. There'll always be things that will come up and might get added anytime as we go forward. There's front-end sections. We want to just chat briefly about that. One of the things that's just so applicable is that you really need to review all of these items pretty much up front. And I'm going to pull up in a second a table of contents of some of the worksheets that we're going to pull up. But in looking at that, you want to make sure that you review these general specs and supplemental conditions right from the beginning, just to make sure you're on the same page. Often we say, well, I bidded a job 2 months ago or a month ago. Doesn't mean it's the same today. Everything is not boilerplate. You may think it is, but there could be variations. You want to be aware of that. And then there's catch-all clauses. You want to just make sure that some of those clauses don't vary from your trend of thought, the way you do business, and in fact that you're aligned with the client. The idea of all of these packages, once again, is to align the client, the developer, the company, the city, the municipality with you and the other contractors on the job. There's some basic relationships. You want to understand the entire construction contract. I mean, this is not telling you anything new, but what often happens is that there's components that affect you. Sometimes there's even impacts of other work being done on site or in your professional contracts that might be a basis for part of your bid. So you want to look at all of that. The addendums can change what was in the original RFP. You want to make sure you stay up to speed. In the case of a tie, usually the specs take precedent over the plans. The idea is try to avoid that. My recommendation, if you think there's a question, probably somebody else does too, ask your question. The shall and shall not. You got to know what that means in each of the specifications, conditions, and plans. You shall do something is pretty straightforward. You shall not, those are particular meanings, and you want to know how it applies to your specific situation. There's usually shop drawings, and the submittals of those shop drawings can help clarify and amplify some of the issues. Well, one of the issues that I find to be very interesting, and I'm going to pull this up because this is the basic package that sometimes understanding the plans and the sheets formats. You have a title sheet, kind of explains the project, dates, due dates, blah, blah, who's the project manager, those kind of things. There's a site plan in your plans, that lays up from a bird's eye view what the site looks like in the construction projects. Now, keep in mind, what we're using for examples here today are more of the construction type projects. You that are consultants don't usually have these kind of elements in your bid package, but there's some similarity. I know when we bid consulting work on management services contracts for the airport, they always set the parameters that, for instance, financial services, we'll be looking at passenger facility charges or something that at least sets the plan, very much similar to what this site plan would do. The architectural sheets are detailed out. They'll talk about the construction, they'll talk about the mechanical, all the elements of the construction of this project with their detail and their blowouts and their specs and their references and their conditions will all be there. Utility sheets, you got to have all the power, gas, water, blah, blah. And they're going to be in there. You have to understand, does that impact you? Does that not? Does the timing of that? Do you need power from the source that's not there until a month down the road? Those kind of basic questions. And I always like to draw a parallel because we're a consulting firm. There's always an analogy also in doing consulting work, even though we're talking construction here. I'll give you a great example. One of the things that happened today, which you guys are seamlessly not going to be engrossed in, I was in Temecula this morning on a business meeting because it was a drop-dead meeting for a big financing that one of my clients is doing. But as it turns out, there are all types of parameters that are specific to this deal that had to get sorted out in a specific time frame, which then led me to try to go and between the 3 different detour routes, fortunately I left in time and we're still here, but it did make for a challenging time. Reason I share this is because in consulting there's analogies to the construction side. Make sure you understand what's going on around you, the impact that will have on your work. Specialty drawings, if they're putting in a XYZ faucet or a XYZ fountain and they're making it out of gold, there could be special drawings and special considerations. Once again, that can impact you. Same thing for management and consulting firms as well. Of course, that's true for A&E firms. And then you want to understand all the line symbols and so forth. Once you've done this somewhat, you begin to get familiar with them. Always just make sure that you are on the same page with your client. We want to look at what we're calling a pre-bid check day list. And when you're bidding, this is a checklist. And we're going to go through it and we're going to read it and let you ask questions as you think. There's going to be samples, intent to bid. There's a preliminary. Some of you are going to be working through primes. Some of you are going to be bidding as primes. But a preliminary is saying to the prime, or sometimes even, but less occasion, to the client, to the owner, hey, look, I'm thinking of bidding. Because what they start doing is making sure they're covered on all the crafts that they have for their contract. And that goes for A&E firms, as well as consulting firms, as well as construction firms. After you send in your preliminary bid and you say, hey, look, this is what I'm thinking, and believe me, they don't hold you to that, at least they shouldn't, at least in my experience, but you may revise it. Your intent to bid could be big. And you may say, oh yeah, I thought I was going to build it from left to right, I'm building it from right to left. And then you're going to submit your actual proposal. So we'll look at one of each. Then there's a bid list, and that's pretty important too. And we're going to a bunch of items. Once again, we're using construction, but the benefit of that is that construction is so detailed, you can apply it to your same thing as an A&E firm. The work breakdown structure, we're going to look at that. But you have to cost out the elements. A lot of you do it by intuitive guts. Oh yeah, it takes me X amount of time. But the bigger jobs that you get, and that's what we're all shooting for, is the bigger jobs with the municipalities. You have to really just put it pen to paper and begin to cost it out. And then at the end, we're going to give you some what we call random facts, rules of thumb. Margin sheet, I may or may not do, but the random facts, we definitely want to make sure, because what we want to do there is to allow you to really get a good handle on some of the things we found in the past that is useful. What I'm going to dive into now is a sample bid. Let me see if I can pull this up now. This is the preliminary scope. You should have on your screen something that says preliminary scope letter, intent to bid. And the reason we want to go through this, and we're going to go through all 3 parts of this, and I like this because it actually lays out what you're thinking and how you're going to go about the bid. We're just using a next generation builders. They're submitting a bid. This is their pre-scope letter. What they're going to be doing is several things, and we're going to just look at those. First of all, they're going to be doing fire service piping. They're going to be doing domestic water, on-site storm drain system, site storm drain system, and then the sewer system. So they're building this up by major component. And major components are sometimes called bid items. They're usually identified in the contract because the evaluator wants to compare apples to apples. It also gives them a feel as to whether you're crazy or not, to be perfectly answered. Because they really want to see that the basic buildup is reasonable. Now, what may happen though is that you do it different. You may put something in your storm drain system that is part of the sewer system cost. So it's not like it has to match up or you are matched one-on-one, but it does make sense to make sure that you are reasonable. And then over, as you go through this, you'll also add up the dollars on the far right side. Let me move my menu here and get that out of the way. And you can see each one will have an item number, a quantity number, times some basis per item, per whatever comes out. And you total it up, and that's your total preliminary bid. So as you are submitting this to acknowledge your interest in bidding, this is the first part of that, which simply says my total estimate. You're not usually held to it, but it gets you in the ballpark. Now, this is the case where there was what we call a revised scope. So what happens is you take the same form, and once again, this is more true for contractors, but you may revise your storm item 4, your storm drain system, and change those numbers here. So instead of what I'm reading here as 122 per linear foot, you may have to change that to 561. Maybe somebody dropped a decimal point or whatever the reason. But because the job hasn't bid it yet, you can send in a revised preliminary bid. It's still preliminary until you send in your final. Keep in mind, when you send in your final, that's it. But this is still in that process. Why do you do this? Sometimes, first of all, it's always good if you're bidding with primes to let them know what you're doing and where you are. Now, they're busy and you're busy, so you can't waste time, and that's not what I'm proposing. But on the other hand, in some particular cases, you'll even come up with, you'll have ideas that maybe they haven't considered, and it may be within your scope, or it may be within a broader scope. So if nothing else, even if you don't get the bid with the prime, they've developed a relationship with you. So to the extent it makes sense and it's practical and productive, don't hesitate to send in a revised bid if you think that's going to benefit the both of you, the prime and yourself. Okay? Now, eventually you have to, as they used to say in the old days, fish or cut bait. And the bid proposal would be your final items, and it would still have all the bid items, but you would list the specifics of what you're doing. Now, in the A&E world, this is usually just dollars, or if it's a time and materials contract, it would be the time of the people that would be involved. Maybe it's each person in that bid item, or sometimes they want you just to bid it in total, and you would just add up all your dollars and then show the labor dollars and the materials dollars. So depending upon the contract, but the concept is you would then revise and finalize all of these items to come up with your final bid. In this case, we show $213,491. So this is a series of both preliminary, revised, and then submitted bid proposal formats. Okay, on my screen, and if the technical thing is working correctly, and I think it is, you should see what we call a sample bid item list. It's a little lengthy, but we're going to go through it. What this is basically a checklist of a number of things. And what we're going to say is that, let's just look at it. You want to make sure you have the pieces, first of all, to do your bid. And this is a construction contract. but you also want to make sure that you then do the steps that are necessary. And let's just use this detail for a construction company and a scenario. And I hope it, and I think it is applicable to consultants as well. I'm going to start on the left-hand column, your general conditions. You want to just make sure that there's a bunch of things that have to happen because you're on site, and you have to have this information, and you can just go down the old checklist and make sure that it's applicable. I'm not going to read it all. Hopefully you can see it. Scaffolding, the whole bit. Just a bunch of checklist items. There's plans. All the plans that you'll get, there's architecturals, there's structural, civil, mechanical, landscaping, permit processing, reimbursables. These are all things that you want to make sure that you've considered in your bid. And once again, there's some analogies even to the A&E type firms. In this case, in any construction project, the preliminary work is the site work. You have fencing, surveying, there's grading, all types, backfill, rocks and tree removal, there's erosions, just a whole host. And you want to make sure you go through a checklist that you have at least thought through that that's applicable or it's not for this particular bid. If it's not, just keep on moving. But what happens is, by having a list, you know, one of the worst things you can come back and do, and we have all done it, is that you get in there and you say, oh yeah, I got my bid built up, but in my site work, I forgot about erosion and dust control. And I just didn't put it in there. Why? Because I didn't go down a checklist. And as you know, dust control is a pretty big deal now. Matter of fact, this one of the issues this morning in this morning meeting that I had was that very thing. The concrete, same thing. If you know, depending upon how familiar you are, and for the architects, obviously these are things you're considering when you're designing and when you're costing out as well, giving a preliminary cost. So foundation, slab work, just reading down this old checklist, these are just things that you build a relationship with yourself and bid process so that you can make sure that you consider all the key elements, because they don't always call out specifically each of the areas you should be thinking about. Metals, masonry, just some more there. I want to just give you an idea of some of these. Let's go back over to the upper right-hand side of the chart. Foundation, drainage, just a whole host. Once again, I'm not going to belabor this, but I do think the approach is what's so critical. Pavement marking, you know, if you do put in a parking lot, you know, you got to paint the stripes. The storm sewage systems, you got to make sure that they're in there. So this is the checklist for the construction. It's a good bid item list. It allows you to kind of go through it and think through it, have it in front, and then you go do your homework. And we're going to talk about how to have a work breakdown structure for each of these areas, because you have to cost these areas out that are applicable. Not all of them will be applicable, but those you definitely want to make sure that you've covered. This is what we're going to call, for lack of a better name, a pre-bid bid day checklist. And the advantage of this thing is that you use it when you're first starting, and you use it once you've almost completed your bid. And the question is why? Well, it's simple. You want to make sure you're getting all the components and that you've done everything it takes to be profitable on your job. So these are questions that we're going to ask. So I'm going to get it so you can read it. Did we visit the site? Do we have the latest and relevant specifications? Do we have the latest sets of plans? Keep in mind, there are variations. Sometimes they're using plans from inventory or standards and so forth. Outdated stuff can really cause a problem. Questions and answers. Do you know who your competition is? You got to know who you're bidding against. Sometimes you got to bid more aggressively than others. Do we need bonding is another example. One once again, I'm not going to go through the whole intent and questions, but I think what I hope each of you get is a feeling of how detailed and organized you need to be when you start reading plans and specs, to organize yourself, that you understand the total picture and that you're getting all the necessary tools and information to do a good job. One of the things that happens here is delivery times, lead times, distances, all of those factors can play in whether you're designing or whether you're actually constructing. Site work, addendum, plug numbers, lot numbers. Are you comfortable with, they're just an intuitive and a technical and objective analysis that you want to do when you start looking at plan specs and the proposals, the RFPs. So this list goes on and on. I'm not going to show or spend time in each. I just want to show that there are very much punitive laws and so forth. That's a big factor. Sometimes you can work after hours, sometimes you can't. And you better know when, because there can be penalties accordingly. And those penalties can be substantial. And if you don't necessarily work the hours you had planned in your proposal, that can skew your costs significantly. If you start putting in weekends and so forth that you hadn't planned for, that can be big. Schedule constraints, there's a whole host of questions there. What are the environmental considerations? And once again, that goes for construction as well as A&E type firms. When you're designing, when you're building architects, when architects are building and designing buildings or facilities of any sort, those are the things that you want to be aware of. Environmental, usually up at the top of the list. The construction plan may not be the best one. The client may suggest this or that and have you bid on it accordingly. And you say, well, basically you should put C before B or B after E. And those are conversations you can have. Now, usually if they've gone far as they have for you to be doing a bid, that means they've issued the RFP. There usually isn't a lot of change, but there could be. It depends upon the magnitude, depends upon the issues and the thoughts of the persons that are involved. As you know, when you start changing the addendums and so forth, or going back out to bid again, there's a lot of time loss. So not only is that something you want to avoid, but the customers, the clients want to avoid that as well. So those are the kinds of things I just wanted to share with you. We're going to cover something now before we go back to the PowerPoint. And just because I want to do that, I'm kind of giving it all while I have it, mostly from a mechanical and a technical standpoint, rather than having to flip between the PowerPoint on and off. I'm going to kind of just cover some of the points with you now. This is what we call the work breakdown structure. And the reason this is important is because it is the hub element of your roll-up of costs as you're reading specs and building your bids. So this actually what we're doing today to introduce you to how the plans and specs and contracts all fit together. We're actually giving you a lot of how you build up your costs, because that allows you to not only know it's a good cost, but to make sure you're in conformance with the plans and specs and contract you ultimately sign. So, and once again, we're just going to use a contracting construction example. And in this particular case, we're looking at a concrete slab. So there's a couple of things, but it's the same way in your case. Now, many of you in the A&E field design in different unique ways. But you always start with something. Maybe you start with the big picture and then you go into the detail. Some of you start with the detail and then you may go into the bigger picture. But however you break it down, similar to how this concrete slab is broken down, it's very simple. You either prep it and you pour it. And once you pour it, then you strip the sides and the forms away and clean it up. So you have to do that in whatever business you're in building. This is called a work breakdown structure. WBS is how we use it for short. So what happens is these three components become the total for this bid item called concrete slab. To do the prep work, we need a foreman at 12 hours. You have quantity, unit, the rate, the labor, the material, and sometimes you need equipment. You companies, A&E firms that are doing environmental work may have to go out and get pothole diggers and get soil samples, or get a drill in. There's a number of things, and if you have to rent equipment, do not forget to put that in there. Sometimes you need subs, and the subs will do component works. They're specialty people. And then there's always other, and then you get your total. So in this case, we're just going to use this work breakdown structure format. There's a foreman who's at 35, laborers at 24. Laborers have the bulk of the hours. And then there's just a whole host of 2x8s, stakes, backhoe, dump truck, and dump fees. Very important. You can't take the dump truck and just let it sit on there. You got to remember to put in the fees. Same thing in A&E. Remember the detail. Remember the little bit of stuff. So anyway, you just simply add it up and you get your total cost for that bid item. Now, what we're not covering today, but what we would cover in other things, is that there's overhead and a direct. There's ways of totaling out a whole nother thing, but that's another class. And this form, but the reason I like this form and I show it here is because in the work breakdown structure, in understanding how to comply with the bid item in your specs, in your conditions, in your plans, ultimately to get a contract, is that you got to break it down. You do the same thing for pouring, and then you do the same thing for pulling off the forms. Once you do all that, you get a total number and you're done. Okay? Let's talk about understanding plans and the sheet format. We talked about all these components: title sheet, site plan, architectural sheet, utility sheet, specialty drawings, and all the symbols. What you just saw is that once you get those items, you go through the process of looking at your bid items, you begin to cost them out, you're submitting proposals, you're submitting preliminary, revising them, and then ultimately you're understanding all of these components and you're putting them into a work breakdown cost build-up structure that allows you to accumulate your costs for the job and then ultimately put your bid out. How to navigate, let's talk a little bit about that. You want to review the red line sample plans that are on the screen. You want to actually talk about, we're not going to pull up anything again, but all of those items that are critical to you in the work breakdown structure, that are in the plans, that are in the specs, you want to pull them up. You want to understand them. You want to highlight them. Oh yeah, I got that covered, or I don't have that covered. You want to make sure that you're referencing the notes. Even after you bid, go back and say, oh yeah, did that note say that? Did that symbol mean that? Did it say go left or did it say go right? Remember, you're working late hours, pushing hard. We all make mistakes. You want to make sure that all of the building codes and the green books and all the reference documents that go along with bidding in the construction industry that you've considered and adequately covered. Now, the RFPs are very similar in that regard. There's sections of the RFP that talk about timing. They talk about who the client is. They give you a background section in the A&E world. And you just want to make sure that you're taking the time to understand the impact that it's going to have on your costs. You want to explain each of the sections during the review. You want to just literally almost talking to yourself or talking to your partner or somebody in the process with you. Because what you want to do is make sure that your interpretation of the action that needs to be done is correct. Sometimes, they say eagles are very costly. Well, there's no place greater where that's true than in misbidding, because you thought one thing, based on your experience, based on your, quote, ego, but that's not what they were asking you. Okay? And of course, if it doesn't fly, you want to go back and get clarification. You want to understand why they want that. If you don't, go back and ask, because if you don't understand why they want that, why they want it that way, why they want that many, whatever the case would be, you could misbid by over or underbidding. And in fact, it could be somebody else's question. So you can always get that clarified before you submit. What I do encourage you to avoid at all costs is coming back and saying, I thought you meant, because that's a hard situation to win. You really want to understand before you submit. And then there's a time limit. There's literally, before you bid, you just simply have to get the questions answered. There's not always a lot, and sometimes they're not major dollars associated with it. And you know, at the end, you're going to put in your fudge factor up or down anyway. So, you know, that's how you kind of make it all work.